Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 7. I'm Carl Chua, I'm an engineer at the Nhvr. Today we have two topics. So the first topic is on the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project, which will be run by Todd Wellard and Jade Light. The second topic is Structural Assessment, which Dr. Neil Lake from Nhvr Queensland will present on. Similar to the previous sessions, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them anytime. It will also be recorded. I think we might answer the questions towards the end. I might pass it on to Todd now and I might do a more formal introduction.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, so welcome everyone. Thanks for taking the time out today to attend this webinar. I think again, as per the other webinars that have been run, this is a really important one for local government road managers in particular. So I'm hoping that you'll get a lot out of it. And as Carl said, by all means ask as many questions as you like and we'll attempt to answer them in the session, otherwise we'll follow up afterwards. So I'm the project manager for the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project. As you can see, it's a mouthful. I didn't stumble there. I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview about what this project is about and why it's so important for local government at this point in time. So we'll just run through. I'll try not to take up too much time here because I think it's really important that we get down to the section that both Jade and also Neil are going to cover off around the structural assessment side of things. That's really, really important that we go over some of those fundamentals. And I think one of the key links here is not just getting a better understanding of our assets, but also that connection from that assessment side of things, which can be quite technical, through to what does that mean for me as a local government road manager who might be assessing applications from heavy vehicle operators. How does that work? So we'll take you through some of that. I think that's an important part of this project plays for local government. All right. I'll do a quick overview of the project. No doubt some of you already know about the project and you're participating in it, which is great to have you on board. We'll probably I'll try and cut my session a little bit shorter than what's shown there, because I want to give Neil a bit more time to talk about the assessments, the tiers versus level. Really important that there's some understanding of the distinction there. And then Jade will talk a bit about the asset assessment process, which again, I think is important that you understand how that actually works. And then towards the end, I'll just give you a bit of an overview around the toolkit that we're developing for road managers. So as we go through this process of undertaking the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project, there's a lot of learnings that are coming out of it. We want to capture that and we want to make that available to road managers for use into the future. I think that's really important that we create those resources for you. All right, so we might just jump into a quick overview of the project. So effectively what's happened here, and some of you would already know this, is that the Australian government provided the Nhvr with about $8 million in funding, specifically for local government and specifically to look at assets such as bridges and culverts and to try and gain a better understanding around those assets. The project, we actually were given the funds back in late 2019 and we've delivered already one aspect of the project and we're now into round one. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But effectively, the good thing here is that the Australian government has recognised the need within local government and we're doing our best to try and get across as many assets as we can over the next period of time. So if we just keep moving, so just some key, I suppose, look, in a lot of ways, as you can see here from these items on the screen, there's quite a lot of discovery in terms of what this project is about. So that first one around key regional freight routes, I think, once again, there's probably a good understanding of the national and state freight routes, but when we get down to the local government road network and some of those regional areas, not as well understood, and so that's a really important component that we need to gain a better understanding of. The second one here, and this is where a lot of our work is really around, it's really around the assessment of assets such as bridges and culverts to see what vehicles can actually travel over them. So as you would no doubt know, a lot of your bridge stock is many years old, and while they're inspected, the program of replacing those is, I suppose, fairly infrequent and obviously involves a lot of money, which generally local government doesn't have access to. But the key thing here is that when these bridges were designed and constructed, they were built to a design vehicle. And that may have been 40 years ago under a different design standard. What we find now, as you would see from the fleet of vehicles on the road network, is that there are vehicles that exist now that did not exist 40 years ago or even 5 years ago, and they potentially are running over these assets. So the question there is, can these bridges and culverts actually take these particular vehicles? So that's a really key one for us to explore, and we've been doing that, as I said, over the past year. So we'll talk a little bit more about that one. I suppose the key thing following that is, once we do all that, what do we do with those learnings and that information that we collect? And this is, I know everybody is always talking about data and collecting data, whether it's social media or whatever else. But this is really, really important that we actually start to collate some of our basic data around our assets so that we're then able to utilise that to undertake assessments and to strategically plan how we prioritise improvement to those assets, etc., etc. It's something that doesn't exist at the moment. Now, I know each of you would have some data that you would hold within council. Our experience has been that at times with the assets that have been nominated, it's been quite difficult to get a hold of some of that data for a whole range of reasons. Plans and things like that over time get misplaced, or perhaps the assets ownership has been transferred from a state department to a council or vice versa, and sometimes we don't have the benefit of all the documents going with that. So this is a really important one, and so that's something that the Commonwealth has asked us to create, is a central location where that information can be stored and obviously utilised. And obviously it's something that we want to keep ongoing. The other part of this, which I think is really important, is that the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project is truly a national project. So unlike the Heavy Vehicle National Law, where both Western Australia and Northern Territory aren't part of that at this point in time, this project does actually include Western Australia and Northern Territory. And we've already done some assessments in Western Australia during our pilot phase. So I think that's really important that we're dealing with this as a nation. And then I suppose the last one there is, look, it's been a really interesting one in terms of developing a consistent approach. And again, look, across the state across the country, I should say, for a whole range of reasons, a lot of the approach to assessment around assets has been done state by state, and there's some inconsistencies around that process. And in some cases, there's good reason for that. In others, perhaps not. One of the things that we've been asked to do is looking at developing some consistency. And I think, importantly, what's come out from local government in particular that we've heard, and also from the local government associations, is to say that, well, look, at this point in time, the local governments don't actually have a framework for assessment. So anything that we can help local government in that regard is going to be of massive benefit. So that's something that's been a really important piece of work that we've been doing over the last year. So they're the key areas. We might keep moving on to the next slide. Where are we at? So look, as I said, we got funding back from the Australian government back in late 2019, and the project officially commenced at the start of 2020, where we undertook a pilot phase of work. So that's now been completed, and there's been a lot of learnings that have come out of that. And it fed into our round one, which is currently happening. Our round one goes through to the end of June 2021, and we've got a big focus here around doing as many assessments as we possibly can in the time. So obviously, we've got a fairly limited period of time here to do that, but we're certainly well underway, and I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. Beyond that is really just our reporting and auditing back to the Commonwealth Government. All right, so if we just keep moving, we've got, so in terms of round one, so round one is what's underway at this point in time. So what we did, we've effectively got 3 intakes in terms of assets that have been nominated or identified to be a part of this process. The first one, intake 1, that you'll see there, was where we went out to all councils nationally and asked councils to nominate their priority assets that they believe need assessment. And you can see there by the numbers, there was around about 1,000 assets that were nominated. from, you know, not far short of 100 councils nationally. Secondly, the second intake, and this was a really important one because where we tend to get benefit in terms of the network and to the economy and to the industry is by looking at a road network in the context of a region where you've got those connected roads working together. So we've actually set out to undertake a trial of a regional approach, and we're currently working with South East Queensland councils. In that process, we've identified a number of assets there to undertake those assessments on. And the third one here, intake 3, you'll see their improvement assessments. So basically this flows out of what we undertook in the pilot phase of the project. So where we assessed 100 assets in that pilot with 12 councils, we found that some of those, while we undertook a tier 1 or 2 assessment, we found that there needed to be more work. So what we've done is we've brought those into this particular round so that we can do more investigation and get a better understanding of some of those assets. Now, as you'll see below in the darker grey box there, we've gone through a process of filtering. So in that intake 1, you'll see we had, you know, almost 1,000 assets, and we're looking at, you know, a bit under 200 that we're assessing in this round. And there's a couple of key reasons for that. One is the data that was provided around those assets. So effectively what happens here is that if we don't have the key data around a particular asset, then we're not able to undertake any sort of value-added assessment, if you like. We could go ahead and do them, but what's going to happen is there'll be so many assumptions made that you would really question the value of any sort of assessment without that information. So what we did was we prioritised the assets that had the information we required, including the design drawings. So that's really, really important. The other factor there that was really key was the time constraints. You know, we're only a couple of months out from the end of the financial year, so we had limited time. So we've basically taken a number of assets that we believe we can get done within the time we've got left. You can see there we've tried to include as many councils as we possibly could. So it's around about 60 that we've got involved in that phase, which out of the 87 is a pretty good number. And as you'll see as well, along with intake 2 and 3, overall, a bit over 230 assets, and we've got almost 70 councils involved in round 1 overall, which I think nationally is a pretty good number. All right, so this is a bit of a distribution of the assets that we've taken in terms of the round 1 intake. So you'll see there we've got a good distribution across all the states. We don't have any that have been nominated from Northern Territory. Certainly our conversations there have been around other issues with the road network rather than actual bridges and culverts. So at this stage we haven't got any that are participating in round 1, but we will still be looking at that and circling back with the Northern Territory towards the end of this phase. Probably no surprises. Look, in terms of New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, the bulk of the asset nominations came from those 3 states. And again, using those criteria that I talked about, we've narrowed it down to those numbers of councils. And as you can see, 4 in South Australia, 1 in WA and 1 in Tasmania. And I suppose just a key point about Tasmania, there's been a lot of really fantastic work that's been done by the Department of State Growth in Tasmania in partnership with all of the councils down there. And so a lot of the assessments that we're looking to do through this project have already been undertaken over probably the last 3 or 4 years by the Department of State Growth. So that was really great work, hence why there's not a lot of councils involved from Tasmania in this phase. All right. And intake 2. So this is the regional approach. For those of you who aren't familiar, these are the councils that are involved. And again, as I said, we're really trying to identify where we've got connections along routes, because obviously roads go across boundaries, these artificial boundaries that we have in terms of the electoral and state boundaries. It's really important that we look at assets that are along that same route. There's no, well, not that there's no value in it, but if we assess one asset on a route and then we don't do another one that's a fairly high priority for heavy vehicle access, then there's limited value in doing that. So we've tried to get that, I suppose, that connectivity across those areas. So we've got about 30 assets that we're looking at across that area. And as I say, this is really important in terms of how we approach these assessments going forward. So that's intake 2, and then intake 3. So this is the one where, as I said, is really a flow on from the pilot work that we did, where we're looking at improvement assessments. So this is a little bit of a point of difference to the tiered assessments that we've undertaken. What we're looking at here is where a structure has been found to have some sort of structural deficiency. What we want to try and understand is what are our options in terms of improving the structural integrity of that particular asset, and particularly in relation to the vehicles that are running on that network. So we're asking our suppliers that we've appointed for round 1, of which there's 4, to actually undertake these improvement assessments as well. I think that's a really important point. I guess what we want to try and do with that, while this particular project doesn't have funds to undertake the actual improvement to the assets, what we want to try and do is connect that through to the Australian Government's Bridges to Renewal program. Coincidentally, it happens to be run out of the same department as which our project is funded. So we think there's a really important connection point there, and we've been talking to the department about that. So we think there's a bit of an opportunity, and that perhaps we can streamline some of that approval process of getting funds through to help improve some of those assets and extend their life, as opposed to trying to stump up the funds to actually replace them. So they're the 3 intakes that we're working on in round 1, and as I said, we've got about 8 weeks left to undertake that work. We're endeavouring to get all of that done. A fair bit of it depends, as I said earlier, on getting that data from all the councils who are participating. And we do know that from the pilot where we weren't able to get that data, that some of those assessments weren't able to be undertaken. So there's a fairly heavy dependency there on councils to actually provide that data, or where it's not available, to actually get out to site and provide that back to the suppliers. So just moving on, in terms of what do we do once we've undertaken these assessments, what do we do with that data? Now, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Nhvr Portal, the system that is used for managing the permit process. So obviously applicants apply for a permit to travel on the roads, and you guys as road managers would then receive those consent requests and assess them. We feel that given the role that the portal plays in that process, that the best place to house this data is within the portal. So that's what we've done. We've effectively set up a layer within our route planner in the system there for local government asset data, and we're basically putting in all the metadata around the assets, which is fairly high level, but it does give you some detail about those bridges. But then we're also attaching the assessment results also. So the idea would be then that these documents, this data, this information is stored in one place, and then it's easy to lay your hands on. You can come straight back to here and find that information. Down the bottom of this screen, the bottom right hand side, you'll see here what we've built is some capability to actually allow road managers to directly input asset data into the system. So this is where the power of the system really starts, by sharing that information, having it in here. It's at your fingertips, but also hopefully that starts to provide, I suppose, a bit of seed data for some of the capability we want to build in the future around being able to do rapid assessments, which is something we'll touch on today. We won't go into it too much, but it's really, really important if we're to enable that sort of capability down the track and avoid these detailed assessments and costly assessments as well. We need to develop that capability, and the beauty of that is that you guys will then be able to process that within the system without going outside, without, in a lot of cases, needing to engage external consultants to undertake that work. That's where we want to get to, and as I say, having the data in the system is key to that. So that's the portal side of things. This here is the actual route planner. So I think we've got, is this a little video that we can run that actually shows you very quickly just how the data is stored?
Let's run that now.
Yep, yeah. Just click on that one there, Carl. You'll see we go to the layers. You'll see there's one here called assets, local government assets. You'll see all those pop up. Now, these are the ones that we did in the pilot. And if you zoom right in and click on any of those, you'll see this metadata pop up. And then down the bottom, there's a more info link. When you click on that, it pulls up the actual summary of the results from the assessment and then the full report that was provided by the consultants. So you can see there how easily accessible that information is, and really, really important that you can lay your hands on it quickly when those requests come through. So that's the sort of capability we've been working on over the past year, and we've been well supported by the guys in the portal team here in NHVR in developing that functionality. All right, keep moving. All right, so look, that's a bit of an overview, I suppose, about the project. Happy to take any questions, just put them through and we'll attempt to answer those at the end of the session. So thank you very much, guys, and I guess I'll hand over now to Dr. Neil Lake.
Yeah, thanks very much, Todd. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine. Now, so we'll take a little bit of time now to just discuss some of the tiers of assessment, and I won't talk about so much how they'll go together. Jade will cover that afterwards, but we'll talk about some of the important variables in terms of what goes into these sorts of assessments. If we just go to the next slide. Thanks, Carl. So typically in Australia, there are three main tiers of assessments that road managers would use. The first one, the Tier 1 assessment as it's called, that's a heavy vehicle comparison using a line model. We've got the Tier 2 assessment, that's a capacity assessment. Tier 3 assessment, that's a site-specific assessment, going into a lot more detail than what you would in a Tier 2. And then, as Todd was talking about before, we've also added in this other one, the Asset Improvement Assessment or Asset Improvement Report. And, you know, when you do these tiers of assessment, what's really important with tiers of assessment is that you understand that while they increase in complexity, one doesn't necessarily mean that the next one, if you get a poor result in one, doesn't mean you automatically go to the next tier of assessment. They're not actually progressive. Really what it's about is picking the right tier of assessment for the particular situation that you're in. And ultimately, you know, what we want to do is get to the point where the tiers 2 and 3 assessments, they actually feed into Tier 1 assessment, because Tier 1 assessment is a much simpler approach and a much more rapid approach, which is what Todd was alluding to there. Tier 1 assessment is really where I guess councils should be centering their heavy vehicle assessment programs, and everything should actually feed into that. But there is that misconception, I think, in the industry that, you know, if you do a Tier 1 assessment, then, you know, and it fails that, or you get a substandard result, I think it's probably more appropriate terminology, then you would immediately move to a Tier 2 assessment. And if you get a substandard result, you'd move to a Tier 3. And that's not actually how the tiers of assessment typically go. In certain circumstances, that might be the case, but that's not always the case. And so going back to the Asset Improvement Report, sometimes it doesn't make any sense to keep doing more assessment because, of course, assessment costs money. It's an expensive exercise. And sometimes, based on what we've done, we know we're never going to get to a positive outcome. And so in those situations, it makes a lot more sense to spend your money on thinking about what your different options are for that particular asset. And so that's what this Asset Improvement Report is all about. Essentially, it's a high-level options study that goes through and works out, well, you know, what are the options for repairing, for strengthening, or replacing an asset. And I guess a key part of that could also be deciding whether higher tiers of assessment might be actually appropriate, and trying to see what you can get out of what's existing. So that's sort of how that goes together. And I think an important point here, if we at the bottom of the slide here, we see that the Tier 1 assessment, I'm saying there that that's a heavy vehicle access assessment, and it's not actually a bridge assessment. And while we use some parameters of a bridge to do that assessment, we're not actually assessing the bridge. We really have to have already assessed the bridge and understand what a bridge's capability is before we do a Tier 1 assessment. And then essentially what the Tier 1 does is just compare that bridge capability to the vehicles that we know can already travel on the structure. So that's why I don't call that bridge assessment. But on the right-hand side, yeah, we're definitely into the territory of bridge assessment, where we're assessing individual elements in a bridge. So we might move on to the next slide. Thanks, Carl. So what I want to do now is go through a few more details about each of these tiers of assessment. And we'll start at the start, I guess, the Tier 1 assessment. And as I said, this is a heavy vehicle access assessment. And to do this kind of assessment, what you really need to understand is what is the bridge capability to take heavy vehicle loads. And by bridge capability, what we're really talking about is what are the biggest vehicles that you know can safely cross a structure. And these are typically defined by a set of reference vehicles. And those reference vehicles could be the full vehicle, but it also could be a percentage of that vehicle that we know. So let's say that we had, you know, an A double vehicle. And, you know, we do some higher level assessment, and we work out that perhaps only 80% of that vehicle is, at 80%, you know, the bridge has met its sort of capacity. So in that case, you know, we've got 80% of that vehicle would be the biggest vehicle that could go across the structure. And if we do that for a range of logical sort of reference vehicles, well, then we start to understand what the bridge capability is. And once we have that, then we have the capability of comparing those vehicles to a vehicle that wants to get access to the structure. And I would typically call that an application vehicle. And so the process of comparison is not so simple. You know, a lot of people, I guess, could make the connection that, you know, oh, well, this vehicle is 50 tons. So our bridge capability or our reference vehicles is, say, 50 tons. And then our application vehicle is 48 tons. Oh, well, that's fine. Well, then we can let that go. But that's not actually the case, because the way that vehicles impact structures, or the way they load structures, is very dependent on a couple of factors. So one is the overall gross mass, but more importantly is the concentration of that mass and over what length of vehicle that mass is, and then comparing that to what is the actual length of the structure. So if you take the case of, say, very short spans, it doesn't matter if you have a very long and heavy structure. What actually tends to govern is more the axle loads, or group axle loads. And so, you know, that's why so basically the Tier 1 assessment gives us a basis to actually compare, you know, different types of vehicles, rather than just trying to compare overall mass. So in order to do that, what we use is a basic structural engineering process using basic engineering statics. And what we do is we produce a one-dimensional line model of the structure. And we understand what the different loading actions develop on that line model for the various reference vehicles or bridge capability. And then, so we're mainly comparing the moments and the shears, and also the reactions are the three key things that we would compare. And then we also run the application vehicle across the same simplified structure, and we compare the results. And essentially, if your application vehicle produces effects that are less than the reference vehicles, well, then you could potentially allow travel across that structure, sorry. There are a couple of key inputs that we need for this. Obviously, we need things like span lengths for each particular bridge. We also need to understand something called the span continuity. So that's where the spans actually are connected across the top of piers. And when they are connected across piers, it allows bending to occur in the top of the elements rather than just in the bottom. And so span continuity is an important parameter that we need when we're doing these kinds of assessments. We also need to understand the bridge capability, as I've discussed, and that's just like a series of reference vehicles that we know can safely travel over the structure. And that's a really important point, because if we don't know what the bridge capability is, we actually can't do a Tier 1 assessment. That is the critical input that we need to know. Now, that doesn't mean we need to rush out and do assessment across every single bridge, higher level assessments like a Tier 2 assessment, which is essentially where you can get bridge capability from. But when all these structures were originally designed in the first place, they were usually designed to particular vehicles, which are called design vehicles. And those design vehicles can form the basis of defining this bridge capability, and we can use those vehicles in Tier 1 assessment. Now, there's a lot of nuance in the application of these things. There's a lot of issues as codes have evolved over time that you need to think carefully about. And I'll talk about how you can find out a bit more about that later on. So that's the basis of a Tier 1 assessment. It's very simple. It's very rapid. You can make it very automated in process, but obviously we need some inputs into it to be able to do that. Now, in terms of any tier of assessment, we actually need to understand the bridge condition when we're making access decisions. So that's one of the key inputs in the Tier 1 assessment. We actually need a current level 2 bridge inspection. Now, level is different from tier. What I'm talking about there is a level of inspection, not a tier of assessment. So usually we're focusing tiers on assessment and we're focusing more levels on inspections, but we'll keep talking about it as we go through these slides. So yeah, critically that current level 2 bridge inspection, you need that information, because if there has been significant deterioration, perhaps your assessment of bridge capability that you already have is not appropriate. Maybe that should be down regulated. And so it's very important, one, that you understand what condition has been considered whenever you've developed bridge capability. Obviously, if you're using the original design loads, you're assuming it's in perfect condition. But yeah, if there has been deterioration, we need to somehow take that into consideration in our access decision making. And by current level, a current inspection, what I'm really talking about there is that you're within a normal inspection cycle of a structure. And for most structures, that's somewhere between 1 and 5 years typically would be an inspection cycle. That inspection cycle can depend on the type of material that the bridge is made from, with things like concrete usually having a little bit longer inspection frequency, and things like timber having a shorter inspection frequency. And so if you're within that normal cycle, then usually you could use that in terms of your heavy vehicle access assessment and just making sure that condition is not affecting the situation. The one caveat to that is that if you do have already significant defects that are potentially deteriorating rapidly, you might need to have a more current bridge inspection when you are making these access decisions. So for instance, if a normal inspection is 5 years, but you know that you've got significant defects and the last inspection was actually done 2 years ago, well, you might need to re-inspect to make sure those defects haven't got significantly worse. So the last point just on this slide is that there's this misconception actually that Tier 1 assessments are not very accurate. And if you go to higher levels of assessment, you're going to get a better result. There's the misconception that actually Tier 1 assessments are very conservative. And I'd like to dispel that myth. The reality is that Tier 1s can be extremely accurate for very accurate decision making. But what's critical in that is that it really depends on 3 things: the quality, the accurateness, and appropriateness of those reference vehicles that define the bridge capability. And so in terms of accurateness, what I mean by that is that an assessment has been done that says, let's say, for instance, one of the reference vehicles was an A double. And if someone has done a higher level of assessment, says the A double is fine across this structure, and that's what's used. So 100% of an A double is used, right? But if the reality is when that assessment was done that actually 120% of the A double could cross the bridge, well then the assessment that you've been using, 100%, is not actually accurate. you could actually get more. And so, you know, for a tier 1 to be accurate, you need to have those very accurate percentages of the reference vehicle, and then they need to be have been carefully calculated. Now, in terms of appropriateness, what I'm talking about there is that there are a couple of key factors that really impact whether a tier 1 is relevant. And generally, what that's all about is how similar are the reference vehicles to the application vehicle that is applying for access. Now, there are two main things that I would typically think about here. One is in-lane vehicles, so vehicles that travel in a lane. And the other one is what I would call straddling lane vehicles. So they're more like heavy load platforms, wide vehicles that look substantially different, and they also travel in a substantially different position on the bridge. And so it's not inherently a valid process to compare an in-lane vehicle to a straddling lane vehicle, right? And it's also not inherently a valid process to compare two in-lane vehicles, one next to each other, with a straddling lane vehicle. They might occupy a similar space, but they actually transmit loads potentially slightly differently into the structure. That's a big part of what we are trying to investigate in this a local government assessment program. We're trying to understand that relationship between in-lane and straddling lane vehicles, so that hopefully in the future, you know, we could just do tier 1 assessments when the only reference vehicles we know are in-lane. But at this stage, we don't know those relationships. It's very dependent on the transverse load distribution properties of a structure, and potentially varies quite significantly from bridge family to bridge family. And so that's something that we're trying to investigate through that process. So at the moment, you know, we really need sort of in-lane and straddling lane vehicles to be able to do tier 1 assessments, depending, of course, on what the application vehicle actually is. So, of course, if you've got an in-lane set of reference vehicles or an in-lane reference vehicle, well, we can assess other in-lane application vehicles. That's no problem. But where the difficulty gets is if, you know, we don't have anything that looks at straddling lane, and then we're having oversize over mass vehicles applying. That's where tier 1 assessment at the moment, with, you know, what we know, we can't really do that well. And a key reason why the local government assessment project is really focused on tier 2 assessments. We're trying to understand that relationship. Okay, I think I've covered most of the things for a tier 1 assessment. I think we'll move on now to the next tier of assessment. So here, tier 2 assessment is essentially very similar to how you would design a structure. The only real variation is that there are some factors that we do know that we might not have known when we designed a bridge. A key one of that being, you know, how the bridge is being used. So, you know, the idea of, you know, vehicles traveling in marked lanes versus design lanes. They're two different things. You know, when a designer designs a structure, they jam the lanes right up against the edge of a structure, which is usually a worse situation, more conservative situation. And the reality is we can get better assessments of capacity if we use how the structure's actually being used. And that's a key difference between design and a tier 2 assessment. But essentially they are the same process. They use the same methods. And essentially what that involves is that we create an analytical model of the structure, typically a 2-dimensional model of the structure. And we do things, we use a technique called grillage analysis. We could also use things like finite element analysis. These are similar processes. And what we do is we actually load these theoretical models, and we work out what are the load action effects that we get in individual members of that structure. And that's a key difference here between tier 2 assessment and tier 1 assessment. Here in tier 2 assessment, we're looking at individual members. We're looking at the individual loading actions in each member. So the moments, the shear forces, the reactions, the axial loads, the torsions, we look at all those things. And we actually compare them directly to what we would calculate as the member capacities. That's the ability of a member to resist those loads. That's the member capacities. And the member capacities are actually calculated using the Australian standard AS 5100. And that's essentially the basis of a Tier 2 assessment. Each individual member must have a more higher capacity than the loading effects that we've calculated. This is a very detailed assessment process. It's very expensive generally to undertake. You know, an assessment could cost anywhere between, you know, sort of $5,000 to, you know, perhaps $80,000, depending on the complexity of the structure. A typical cost would be, you know, somewhere between sort of 10 and 15,000 would be pretty typical to do a Tier 2 assessment. And importantly, you need people who are experienced bridge engineers to do this kind of assessment. Like, this is not something that you could throw at a graduate and say, oh, you know, you went to university, how about you try and do a Tier 2 assessment on a bridge? It's something that needs quite extensive experience to undertake. The Tier 1 assessment, I don't think is anywhere near that. I don't even think that you really need to have that structural engineering background to do a Tier 1. But Tier 2, definitely you need that. You need to be working under the guidance of someone who really knows what they're doing. So that's someone that's done sort of assessment for 5 to 10 years, I would say, would be typical. The key inputs that we need for this sort of work, we need bridge drawings. We can't do this kind of assessment without knowing what's actually inside the individual elements in the bridge. We need to understand what the concrete strengths are. We need to understand what the reinforcing is, what the pre-stressing is, what the material properties are. These are all inputs that we have to know to be able to do a Tier 2 assessment. Another critical input, of course, is bridge condition, just like, you know, in every tier of assessment. We really need to incorporate that. A lot of people think that Tier 2 assessment is theoretical, and that's a terminology that is used all the time. But what that means is that we're doing calculations, we're making models using theory. But the reality is you must always consider bridge condition when you're making any assessment of bridge capacity. And you also need to use that when you carry that on and potentially use the results of this in a Tier 1 assessment. So you have to consider bridge condition. A theoretical approach is not very useful if it doesn't consider that, if you don't have it. So I guess the last point that I just wanted to make on Tier 2 assessment is that there's many different, well, there's not many, but there are a couple of different outputs that you can get from a Tier 2 assessment. You know, you can just assess that capacity directly against the load effect, but the load effect isn't just the vehicle load, it's also many other load effects as well. But one key output that you get from a Tier 2 assessment is something called a rating factor. And what that actually does is it arranges the assessment in a way that we're actually thinking about what is the available capacity for traffic load effects, such as what we're primarily concerned here with heavy vehicle access. And we're putting that over the traffic load effects of a nominated rating vehicle. So we're essentially saying, well, this is how much capacity is available for load effects, and we divide that by the load effects that the rating vehicle exerts. Now that creates what's called a rating factor. Now that's an important sort of number, because essentially if we use this information to push it back into a Tier 2 assessment, which is how the whole process is meant to work, then the rating factor is actually that percentage of the reference vehicle. So it's an important way to present results of a Tier 2 assessment. And then certainly if you're engaging people to do Tier 2 assessment, this is the sort of output that you want in order to be able to upscale the results and use them in a Tier 1 assessment. All right, we'll move to the next slide, thanks. So Tier 3 assessment. So this is where we, you know, the Tier 2 is more theoretical in approach. We're using a lot of general parameters, but you know, there can be instances where we could do some more site-specific assessment on a structure to basically improve our understanding of actually how the structure is working at the time. And so this can involve a multitude of different activities. It could be as simple as just doing some cores to work out what the actual concrete strength is, Or it could be very complex, doing higher level sorts of analysis, nonlinear plastic methods. We could use assessment methods based on overseas standards. We could do field testing, that sort of thing. We could go and in much more detail look at the deterioration. We can try and model that, and we could try and understand it. We could try and incorporate that into our assessments. So there's a whole multitude. Certainly we could go and collect information on the sorts of vehicle loads that are using the structure. We might be able to use that sort of what's called weigh in motion data to actually calculate, well, what are appropriate load factors? What are the probabilities of events occurring together? All these sorts of information. So we're talking about high level stuff. You would only use this assessment if it made sense. So, you know, if your tier 2 assessment has shown that, you know, you've got some, you know, your assessment ratings are pretty close, you know, you might be up pretty close to making it work, but you just want, you know, and you've looked at the structure and you think, oh, but if we just had a bit more concrete strength in this mix, maybe we could get our assessment results a little bit higher, particularly, you know, on things like shear, that sort of thing. And so you might make that decision, oh, well, if we go and we do this bit of testing, we might be able to get a better assessment outcome. But certainly, if a structure is not meeting the tier 2 assessment requirements, you're getting substandard results, does not automatically mean that you would go to a tier 3 assessment. Really, there has to be some sort of business case and likelihood of a favourable outcome to go to a tier 3 assessment. So I think if we move on to the next slide, please, Carl. I think that sort of covers tier 3 assessment. Now, within Australia, there is quite a wide variation in terminology on these tiers of assessment, and I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about that now. So the tier 1, 2 and 3, as I've discussed so far, that's really focused on what Austroads defines the tiers of assessment to be. And that little tech note that came out from Austroads was agreed to by all of the state road authorities as being the tiers of assessment that they, you know, agree. So they've come up with a common terminology. So tier 1, these are all what they would call bridge asset owner assessments. So tier 1 is an access assessment. Tier 2 is a structural assessment, AS5100. As I discussed, that's a capacity assessment. And tier 3 is site-specific or higher order assessment. Now, of course, there are variations in what people call things, and I've used there the example that TMR, their tier 1 is actually a tier 0, tier 2 is a tier 1, tier 3 is a tier 2. It's really important that we understand these differences in terminology so that when we're talking to people, you know, everyone is on the same page and you're talking about the same thing. This is critical where, let's say, for instance, if you're working in Queensland and you go to a consultant and say, oh, I want a tier 2 assessment done. Well, if they've done a lot of work for TMR, they might think that a tier 2 is actually a tier 3 assessment. So it's important that you understand those differences. And then if we look on the left-hand side of this slide, we also have Pbs tiers of assessment. Now, these tiers of assessment are outlined in the performance-based standards documentation. And it's slightly different again. And so just in terms of lining them up, I've done that for you here. A tier 1 assessment for the Pbs setup is basically complies with the bridge formula. A tier 2 assessment is essentially the same as a tier 1 bridge asset owners assessment. That's where we're making sure that, you know, the application vehicle doesn't create effects worse than the vehicles that you know are safe to cross the structure. So that's essentially a tier 2 Pbs is the same as a tier 1 bridge assessment. And then the tier 3 Pbs assessment is a detailed bridge inspection, and that could incorporate tier 2, tier 3. So that sort of helps with trying to understand how all that terminology varies. Importantly, you can see that the ones on the top that are shaded in pink, these are vehicle assessments, right? So we're not assessing a bridge. We might use some parameters of a bridge, like the bridge span and the continuity, but we're not actually assessing the bridge. Those bridges have already been assessed. We already understand what the capability of those bridges are through a set of reference vehicles, and we use those vehicles to compare to the application vehicle, just using simple line models, simple statics. We're not actually assessing the bridge. we're comparing vehicles to vehicles. And that's why we call it a vehicle access assessment, not a bridge assessment. The ones on the bottom, we're talking about bridge capacity assessments at that stage. All right, so if we just pop to the next slide, I think the last thing that I just wanted to cover off on is bridge inspections. So in order to do these assessments, it's very important, as I've said already, that we have a level 2 bridge inspection, not to be confused with tiers of assessment. There are actually 3, well, there can be, it depends on the terminology that different organisations use, but typically there are 3 levels of inspection. A level 1 is, you know, sort of often part of your maintenance process, and you just go out and have a quick look over the structure. We're not looking at inspections at a detailed level for that. So a level 1 inspection is not really suitable for assessing access. It could be used as a touch-up. You know, you've got a current level 2, but you're worried about something particularly that's deteriorated. You might do a level 1 inspection to go and have a quick look at that specific defect. But generally, you need that level 2 inspection in order to be assessing access. And so what that level 2 inspection, it's often known as a structure condition inspection or a condition rating inspection in Australia. It's pretty consistent in Australia how this is done. Generally, it's all of the states, I think, all use this same process. It's generally a 1 to 4 rating of individual components, where 1 to 2 is, you know, the components are okay, and 3 to 4 there's some sort of defect that's starting to occur. And, you know, sort of percentage of the structure in different conditions, and each individual element is actually assessed as part of that process. All the defects get logged. And you can see an example. There's on the right-hand side of that slide, you can see an example of the sort of outputs that you would get from a level 2 inspection in Queensland if you're using the TMR structure inspection manual. It goes through this basic process of rating every individual component on a 1 to 4 rating. So that's an important part of it. A level 3 inspection is a more detailed, you know, you're looking at a particular issue. There can be crossovers with level 3 inspections and tier 3 assessments, and often they would be almost the same thing, but not quite. So when you're talking about a tier of assessment, you're actually assessing, you know, the capacity to take load, whereas the tier 3 assessment could be just trying to assess a particular defect, so to speak. It might not be so concerned about the ability of a structure to take load, but often those two are used interchangeably, and so yeah, it's not a big deal for what we're talking about here. All right, so I think I've taken you through all the different tiers of assessment. Next slide, please, Carl. Now, I've only had quite a short time to talk about those things. I've gone through a lot of detail and skimmed over a lot of stuff. And so if you're in this game of having to assess access, I'd strongly encourage you to come along to this Assessing Heavy Vehicle Access course that we run at Institute of Public Works and Engineering Queensland. This course is a one-day course, and it's primarily focused on getting you know, road managers, particularly at that local government level, up to speed on how all these things fit together, and how to undertake tier 1 assessment, how to know when you're doing it in a valid way, you know, when you're straying outside of that sort of valid way. So it overviews the heavy vehicle access landscape. We really go into more detail about those tiers of assessment. We understand how we can make decisions when we're thinking about bridge access. And it really focuses on that tier 1 assessment, how to use it. How do you actually define your bridge capability and then use that in tier 1 assessments? And then, you know, how do you work with consultants to get the right outcomes? Because, you know, it's a relatively new area, actually, tier 1 assessments. A lot of the state road authorities have been doing this for many years, but, you know, outside of that, it's not used that much. And so understanding how this whole process goes together and making sure that you're getting what you need from consultants, I think is really important. And we'll cover a lot of that in that course. So just go along to the website, register your interest if you're interested in doing that course. And yeah, I think that'd be a very good investment of a day. So that brings my section to a close. Now, I just want to hand over to Jade to talk a little bit more about how the different tiers of assessment actually go together. And just keeping in mind that really important point that a Tier 1 doesn't lead to a Tier 2, doesn't lead to a Tier 3. It's really all about selecting the one that's appropriate, and the stuff Jade will talk about. We'll take you through that process. All right, thanks very much, Jade. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Neil. So I'll be walking you through the asset assessment process and the assessment type selection.
We go to the next slide, yep.
Okay, so what you're looking at here is the higher order assessments flowchart that comes from the Oxford's publication. So in terms of which assessment level to assess and process, the project team has developed a flowchart that'll be very beneficial to road managers in the future. So this flowchart here has been used as a base. However, it doesn't quite cover all of the points that we really need to help solidify some understanding around it. Next, please. So what we're looking at here is an updated flowchart that the team and Dr. Neil Lake have worked together on. So what we're looking at here is all of the inputs that are required to perform an assessment. So if we're looking at the very top line there from start to end, that is our happy path, assuming that we have all of the information that we need. So you'll see that the first step here is to see if you have a level 2 inspection, because we need to have a current understanding of what the condition of the asset is. We now lead into the reference vehicles. So a reference vehicle must be of similar ground contact width and position on the bridge. So we need to understand that if we're comparing a reference vehicle and an application vehicle, they must be the same in terms of the lane positioning. So an in-lane vehicle must be compared with another in-lane vehicle, and the same applies with a straddling lane vehicle also. So the next step here is, does the asset have any defects? Have they been identified in the inspection? So if the answer is no, then we can continue on and perform a Tier 1 assessment, because the design vehicle is still the reference vehicle. However, if we do find that there are inspection defects, then perhaps our design vehicle is not appropriate anymore. So now we look at the design or construction drawings. This is a crucial part that we need to perform an accurate Tier 2 assessment, and you'll see that the data input for the Tier 2 assessment lists things like the full geometry details, the material properties, reinforcing details, pre-stressing details, etc. So this is very, very crucial. And in the case where we do not have any construction or design drawings, we can consider doing a Tier 3 assessment. But as Neil has stated earlier, this can be very costly, and perhaps we don't have all the resources to perform that. So assuming that we move past all of the Tier 1, 2, or 3 assessments, and we look at the outcome. Do we have a favorable outcome? Yes, then we can update the reference vehicles for that asset. However, if we receive a substandard outcome, then we can look at further action. And so if we would like to undertake more assessment, and when I say more assessment, I mean, are there opportunities to improve the analytical assessment results with a focus to potentially achieve more favorable outcomes by undertaking a Tier 2 or 3 assessment? That part of the flowchart where it says yes will take us around again to the design or construction drawings. However, if we do not believe that we need to undertake more assessment and we know that we want to look into improving the asset, then we can look into an asset improvement assessment and consider improving the structure. So what we want to do in the longer term is understand how in-lane and straddling lane vehicles compare to one another. So hopefully in the future we can upscale this so that we can understand how in-lane vehicles can be compared to straddling vehicles. Okay, so this can be a very useful tool to assist with decision making as we move through the project. And the flowchart is still in the draft stage, but we do hope to share the final chart with councils to act as a valuable tool to assist with decision making. And now I'll hand back to Todd. Thank you.
Thanks, Jade. Thank you, Jade. Okay, so I think we've probably covered off a lot of the technical detail in terms of the structural assessments, and obviously, as you know, what Neil and Jade have covered in the short amount of time is probably a fair bit of information, but obviously we can follow up and provide you more. And certainly, if you have the opportunity to attend the IPWIAC course that Neil was talking about, I would highly recommend it. Some of us here, in fact, all of us here in the room have attended that course. And it was excellent, and my sense was that I would see that as essential training for any road manager to go along to that course and learn a bit more about bridge assessment. So if you get the opportunity, then that would be fantastic. So I guess, I suppose circling back, you know, it's really important that we capture the learnings and the resources, including what Jade has just shown you in terms of that process that you go through of determining what's the most appropriate assessment to undertake for an asset. All those things become really, really valuable resources that we want to look at pulling together, or we are pulling together into a road manager toolkit towards the end of this project. So a few elements, I suppose, involved in this is firstly a planning stage. So looking at initial design phase of assets, some of the considerations that you might go through there. Then looking in step 2, a comparison phase. So when we look at asset data, and as we've said throughout this webinar, it's really, really important that we have data around the asset to enable, you know, the better understanding of assets and the determination of a decision regarding access, but also starting to feed into some capability around our rapid assessment, as both Neil and myself have touched on. And then really importantly, review phase. So as I said at the start of this webinar, you know, there's a lot of work that we're going through, that we're doing in terms of discovery through this process. There's a lot of material that already exists, and I guess what we've tried to do is, where we can, where it's appropriate, is advance that material, particularly putting on the local government road manager hat. So what Jade just presented to you, where you had the Austroads flowchart, which really is the kind of base level decision-making process to go through, we really felt that there was some information that could be added into that would benefit local government in terms of making those decisions around, if I want to engage a consultant to do an assessment of an asset, how do I actually go about it? And how do I know that the work that they're doing is the most appropriate assessment to undertake? So those sort of resources we feel are really important that we develop and share them with local government. Look, beyond the time frame of this project, there's no doubt that will continue to evolve over time. So the important thing is that we undertake that initial piece of work and make sure that we provide those to you. And I suppose the last one here around this interpret, the fourth piece, really just trying to understand when you get an engineering report, actually understand what it's saying. So what we've found is that a lot of these documents, they're probably, from our experience in the project, obviously there's a lot more assessments that have been undertaken outside of the work that we've been doing. But what we've seen is that a lot of these reports are highly technical, and a lot of the road managers, particularly through the pilot, did struggle to understand some of the terminology and some of the concepts and actually interpreting what do the results actually mean. So the point that Neil made around percentage of reference vehicle is a really, really critical aspect to this. So where we want to get to is to try and impart that knowledge so that we see that it's not just a black and white pass or fail. It's really about understanding what those results mean and how you can then apply it. So there's some of the tools that I guess the information we develop will hopefully help provide you with that understanding as we go. Now, all this information we want to house in the one place so that it's easily accessible to you. we think that's really important, and obviously we're working hand in hand with IPIAC around some of these as well, and they've got certainly, including the courseware that Neil has developed. All together should be tools that should assist local governments across the board. All right, we'll move on to the next one.
The last slide.
Yeah, so look, what we've done, and some of you might already be aware of this, is that we've developed, I suppose, a bit of a platform for the project so that you guys have got this information at your fingertips. Some of you would already be familiar with it. So this is called Engagement Hub, but we've set this up specifically to provide a better understanding of what the project's about and give you an opportunity to also interact. So as you'll see down the bottom there, one of the key things we've done is put that interactive map into the system where anybody who registers on the site, whether it be a heavy vehicle operator or whether it be a road manager, can actually put on their drop pins on for assets that someone believes is critical and potentially should be assessed. So we're using that as a mechanism just to gauge the scale of the problem and to get a better understanding of where we might need to target some of our assessments. So that's been quite useful. You see the link there, there to the Engagement Hub. If you haven't already, jump on there, have a look around, you'll get a better understanding of the project. You can also interact with us from there as well. It just makes it easier to have it all in the one place. So please jump on and have a look. All right, I think we've just about covered off everything, haven't we, Carl?
Yeah, I think we're just about done. There are a handful of questions. Some I might be able to just get in touch with you directly, but I might just go off the top of this for you if you don't mind.
Sure, yep.
It's not just for you, Todd. How do I know, or how can I find out if my council is part of your project? I think, yeah.
Yes, good question. So if you jump into the Engagement Hub, you'll be able to see for round one. So we're talking about round one that's currently in progress. I would hope that most people, I know there's different people that these emails might have gone to back in September when we first asked councils to nominate. But we did last week also publish through our normal local government update a list of all the councils that are in round one. So you should have received that email. If it's still not clear, you see there's an email address at the bottom of the screen, roadassetproject@nhvr.gov.au. You can jump in there. But if you go on to, as I was saying earlier, if you go onto the Engagement Hub and you go to round one, you'll see a list of all the councils that have been included. Now look, I think it's an important point here around this because, you know, we received almost 1,000 nominations, which was really fantastic. But in the time that we had, there was no way we were going to be able to assess all of those assets. So we did have to reduce that number down. And I did talk a little bit about, you know, how we prioritise them, and, you know, having the data, obviously, plans and things like that was key. But we found that there was a lot of councils that nominated up to about 20 assets. So in some cases, I don't think we had anywhere, any council had all the information we required. So those ones have dropped further down the list. What are we going to do with the balance of all those 1,000 assets? That's a very good question. I'm not sure if it's on there, Carl, but I'm going to preempt it and answer it anyway.
That's all right.
Because we do, even though we're going to be doing, you know, 230 odd assessments, hopefully in this current phase, there's still hundreds that we haven't even got to. So what we're hoping to do, and we have put in a proposal to the Australian government for further funding. What we're hoping we're going to do, and we're, you know, the federal budget is about to be released in the coming weeks. We're hoping that we're going to get further support for this initiative so that we can continue it beyond June. And what we'll be doing then is looking at all of those assets that we haven't had an opportunity to assess. Remembering that if we don't, and Neil made the point as well, if we don't have the design drawings, we are really hampered in terms of undertaking any sort of valuable assessment. But that's when we would start to look at those next 600 or 700 assets that we had in the list. And again, depending on how much funding, if we are lucky enough to get further funding, how much funding we get and over what period of time, because just as Neil was saying, you know, when we get into the tier 2s and 3s and even the asset improvement reports, they're quite time consuming to undertake. So depending on how long the funding is over, will determine also how many of those we're able to undertake. So yeah, but to answer your question, jump onto the engagement hub, go to the page that says round 1, and you'll be able to see all the list of councils that are included in the assessments for that phase.
Awesome, thanks Todd. One here for Neil about the course. Is there an opportunity to discuss culvert assessments in the heavy vehicle course?
Yeah, absolutely. We do cover some stuff on culverts, and yeah, definitely culverts are a little bit different to bridges in a lot of ways, particularly in that, you know, usually the key governing loads are actually wheel loads, not, you know, vehicle loads. But yeah, certainly we discuss those issues around culverts. So.
Awesome. And I might put there are a few comments about yeah, where can I find more information about that course. What I usually do, I send out like a resources email after each of these sessions. So I'll probably put a few links on there for everyone, even the recording link and everything. Just see here, just a question about the Austroads report regarding the tiers of assessment. They're just asking where can we find that document. I can find that and send it out as well.
Well, actually, I mean, those documents are freely available to anyone. All you have to do is go to the Austroads website. You just need to make a sign up. You just need to sign up to Austroads, which is free. And after that, then you can just search for those documents. So it's very easy to get those.
No worries. And just a comment here, Cliff, about bridge formula loaded for tier 1 assessments. I'll be able to. I'll get in touch with you after this. I'll be able to find you some information on that. I think we're at the end. Alright, so I think we might wrap it up if that's all right with you, Neil.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks for attending, everyone. I should have the recording out probably by the end of the week, as well as the resources. If you do have any other further questions, please get in touch with me directly. I'll be able to pass them on to Todd and Neil if need be. Yeah. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.